Below the surface of the sea, much of what happens under that water remains unexplored. My guest today on the Global Yardie podcast has been exploring and investigating what happens way below the surface of the sea. She is marine biologist, Dr. Diva Amon. For more on this podcast and also how you can find out much more on the work the High Seas Alliance does, visit highseasalliance.org. Dr. Amon, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me, Ryan. It's great to be here.
What drew you to exploring below the surface of the sea?
You know, I think growing up in the Caribbean was really the first step. We're blessed to be on this island surrounded by ocean, and in the Caribbean, the deep ocean is actually the largest ecosystem that we have. It's over 90% of the space of the Caribbean. But yet still, like growing up, I didn't really know that was a possibility. It wasn't really until I went to university where I was studying marine biology. And I went there, I should say, with the intention of really, researching more of the more typical marine environments we think about, like coral reefs and seagrass and mangroves. But it was in that degree that I took a course on deep sea biology. The professor said that far less than 1% of it had ever been explored, and what more do we want then? Well, what more did I want at that point in time than to be able to see things no one has seen before, answer questions no one has answered before, and that is really what you're doing when you're working in the deep ocean. It is time and time again going where no one has gone before, and that desire to explore has moved into one to really wanting to understand and really wanting to conserve, because it is a very special place.
For those of you who are not familiar with the work Dr. Amon does, she has explored some of the most remote parts of our planet, and that comes with a lot of experiences. Dr. Amon, I just wonder, what are some of the most unforgettable ecosystems and species you've encountered?
That question is one of the hardest ones to answer, just because every single expedition that we go on in the deep sea, there is always an amazing new discovery that is made and incredible sights to be seen. But if I had to pick just one or two, the first I'd say was my first ever research expedition. This was in the Cayman Trench, so just off of the Cayman Islands in Jamaica. And we were looking for the world's deepest hydrothermal vents. I'm not sure if you know what a hydrothermal vent is.
Can you tell us?
Sure. So they are essentially deep sea ecosystems where there are cracks in the seafloor. Out of those cracks gushes super hot chemical rich fluid that build up into chimney-like structures over time. So that super hot chemical rich water, which actually looks kind of like white or black smoke depending on the temperature, those chemicals that are coming out of it actually are able to power entire ecosystems. Wow. So there are animals living down in the depths on these hydrothermal vents that use the chemicals as their source of food. Unlike, we're accustomed to photosynthesis, using sunlight as a source of food, but no, down here, these ecosystems are completely independent of sunlight, and that just blows my mind. And we were down there, we were looking for the world's deepest ones, which we found, and I just remember that moment. They came into view, these gorgeous sort of like drain pipe like chimneys, and coming out of the top of them was this billowing black water, and all around the chimneys were these thousands and thousands of blind white shrimp. Beyond that, amazing white glowing anemones, and then fish. And it became very clear to us very quickly that every single animal we were looking at in that ecosystem, which had never been seen before that point, was brand new to science.
Wow.
Again, every single species was new. And this happens time and time again in the deep ocean.
It's still blowing my mind in some regards that without the existence of sunlight down there, that the ecosystem could thrive.
Absolutely. And I mean, I should say the deep sea is a really difficult place. Like, we cannot comprehend living there. It is dark, there's no sunlight. It is under extremely high pressure, and it is near freezing, right? So this is not a place that you and I would be able to live, and yet life down there is absolutely thriving, absolutely thriving.
Let's talk a little bit about the BBNJ, that is the Biodiversity Beyond National Jurisdiction. It is gaining in both momentum and global attention, Dr. Amon. Can you talk to us a little bit about the importance of the BBNJ?
So the Biodiversity Beyond National Jurisdiction Treaty, BBNJ Treaty or BBNJ Agreement or High Seas Treaty as it's known, is a really landmark, it's this enormous process that has culminated in this landmark decision very recently, which essentially is all of the countries through the United Nations coming together to essentially conserve and sustainably manage all biodiversity, all life in areas beyond national jurisdiction. So this is more than half of the entire surface of the planet is this area we're talking about. So in the ocean, the ocean is split into two forms of governance. One is national waters, which can go up to 200 nautical miles from the coast, and that it will be governed by that country. Then beyond that, there's areas beyond national jurisdiction, or ABNJ. We get into this alphabet soup very quickly. And ABNJ, or international waters as it's known, that belongs to no one country. And so that is where the United Nations comes into play. And all of the countries who are party to the United Nations and the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea coming together to really, essentially now, through this agreement, as I said, conserve and sustainably manage all life in this space. And it has four main sort of tenements. First is ABMTs, area-based management tools, which is things like marine protected areas. Environmental impact assessments is the second. Marine genetic resources is the third. And the fourth is capacity building and technology transfer. And it is through those four main pillars that really those are sort of the pillars that are going to guide how we essentially make decisions and manage any human activities in this space in the future, and how we potentially protect biodiversity and use it in a sustainable way in the future.
It's such a critical tool, I would say, for the health of our oceans, but more so, Dr. Amon, you were making the point a few minutes ago. We sometimes view Caribbean islands as small island states, but in reality, we're a large ocean state. So
Absolutely.
This is even more critical for us in the region.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll talk a little bit about the regional context and also the global context. So, as I said, in the region, we're absolutely big ocean states, and we are bounded by international waters. The global ocean is all connected. Those lines that we have drawn on the map don't actually mean really anything to the life that lives there, right? And so it means that we need to be thinking about management in a holistic way for the global ocean. And we need to do that because the global ocean is essential for our life on Earth and all life on Earth, whether it is through regulating our climate, which we know it does from absorbing heat and sequestering carbon, whether it is through the provision of fisheries that billions of people rely on around the world as a primary source of protein, whether it is for recreation, right, relaxation. The ocean is an essential part of our life and all life, and we will not be able to have a healthy and sustained planet and resilient planet if we do not take action to essentially conserve and sustainably use the largest part of the ocean, which is the high seas.
Right. From a Caribbean perspective, because you have outlined how important this is to the region, how can Caribbean nations contribute in a meaningful way to the ongoing negotiations as it pertains to the BBNJ?
So we're at a really important stage of the BBNJ agreement, which is ratification, signing and ratification of the agreement. Currently, there are just above 20 countries globally that have ratified, and many, many more who have signed. We need to get to 60 ratifications for that treaty to be able to take effect. There are many Caribbean nations that have not yet signed or ratified this agreement. So that would be a first really critical step. But I should say that at the BBNJ negotiations that have been happening over the last 20 plus years, CARICOM has been an absolute and continues to be an absolute powerhouse. We are really leading the way, and I say we, royal we, but I have not been part of the CARICOM delegation, but the CARICOM negotiators have been doing an amazing job really leading the way on many of the key components of the BBNJ treaty. And I think apart from the signing and ratifying of the agreement, where we also need to be looking as a region is on greater awareness for for more of the population of the Caribbean. This, right now, it's a very niche, it appears to be a very niche issue that negotiators and governments are working on, but actually this affects us all. And so as many people as possible should know enough to be able to inform the decisions that our countries are making in these global settings. And so I think that's also something that we can work on in the future.
Part of that conversation, Dr. Amon, includes marine genetic resources that a lot of people say is critical in this conversation surrounding the BBNJ. First of all, to our viewing audience, can you explain what MGRs are, and then how can it really have a huge impact on the BBNJ as it pertains to things like conservation, deep sea science, new industries?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And as we talked about, this is one of the 4 pillars of the BBNJ agreement. And so marine genetic resources are essentially the genetic components of any of the life in the deep sea or the high seas. And I should say the deep sea is most of the high seas. In the high seas. And it's not just the genetic components, but it's also the structure. It can be the structure of an organism, so that might inspire. And this is very important because we use these. So for instance, for medicine, many new types of medicine are derived from marine genetic resources. There are lots of pharmaceutical leaps, biotechnological leaps. I'll give you a good example. For instance, there is an enzyme that has come from the deep ocean, where it is found on the bones of dead whales, and it digests fats.
Wow.
Right, in that very niche environment. But that enzyme was taken and essentially taken to the lab, adapted, and now has been incorporated into washing powders, like to be able to wash our clothes.
Wow.
And the reason I did that was because in the deep sea, temperatures are near freezing. And so enzymes are accustomed to operating at their maximum efficiency at those temperatures. And of course, we all want to be washing our clothes at lower temperatures because of climate change. So now this is a way for us to be able to wash our clothes more efficiently at lower temperatures. So that's just one example, but for instance, it could be like new cancer treatment, new antibiotics, whatever it might be. There are lots of ways that life in the deep sea can benefit us through marine genetic resources. The question is really around how can we ensure that harnessing these marine genetic resources is sustainably done and equitably done. And this is really where the BBNJ agreement comes in, and its implementation is going to be critical to that.
Do you see the potential for us here in the Caribbean to harness the potential of MGRs when it comes to economic development, innovation, things like that?
Yeah, so we're absolutely in the age of the blue economy, using the ocean to benefit us. And this is one of the reasons why the BBNJ agreement is so important. The high seas may seem remote, from us. It's a place that not many of us will ever go in our lifetimes, but yet humankind is using this space more and more, whether it is for shipping, whether it is for, as you said, harnessing marine genetic resources. We use it in lots and lots of different ways. So if we're thinking about using marine genetic resources to benefit the Caribbean, for instance, there are a number of things that need to happen before we can do that. And I'd say the main one is that working in the high seas is incredibly expensive. Mm-hmm. You require large vessels that are able to go offshore for a long time. If you're working in the deep sea, you require remotely operated vehicles or submersibles. All of these equipment cost millions of dollars. And actually, in the Caribbean, as a deep sea scientist, I can tell you, we do not have any of these assets. So we need to be able to get to out into the high seas, to then be able to harness them, and then be able to go through the process of essentially testing, commercializing, isolating, testing, commercializing, all of these things. So it's going to be a steep learning curve, and that is really where the component of the BBNJ agreement around capacity building and technology transfer is going to be critical, because many states, the Caribbean is not isolated in this space. Most developing countries cannot afford to do this currently, engage with marine genetic resources or high seas, many aspects of these high seas exploration and use. And so we need to be able to step up there and have help to essentially be able to engage in a meaningful way.
You know, Dr. Amon, I'm listening to you speak, and I have to ask you, how then can we ensure, because we have such large ocean states, as you yourself mentioned, how can then we ensure that we have the type of access, fair access to the MGRs, and not only fair access, but our people reap the benefit of the MGRs?
And so that's really, again, where the BBNJ agreement comes in. It has an access and benefit sharing mechanism as part of it that is meant to allow countries that do not currently have access to be able to benefit from the exploitation of, for instance, marine genetic resources. But really, you know, I think something else that does need to happen to help regions like ours, the Caribbean, and other developing nations around the world engage is really, we need greater investment in science. We need greater investment in building the frameworks that will help us to engage with these types of mechanisms. And that is going to require investment, which is not easy to come by. And so we need to be looking at partnerships, equitable partnerships, where we have a leading role, and really exploring the many ways that we can potentially begin to engage. Again, and I think it's not just about engaging, it's engaging in a meaningful and leading way.
Part of your work has been advising governments on this BBNJ agreement. Do you feel that Caribbean nations at this point in time are prepared both legally and institutionally for the oncoming, the emerging BBNJ agreement?
You know, I think that's a really great question and a really difficult one to answer, and that is because ultimately this is a brand new global agreement, and I would hazard to say that there are not many nations that are prepared to be able to engage in this treaty, and so is the Caribbean ready in terms of from a governance perspective or from an institutional perspective? I think we do have some work to do, and also from an education perspective for the general population as well. We do definitely have some work to do, but I think it is very much achievable if it is something that we begin to dedicate more time to in the Caribbean.
You mentioned education, Doc. I also want to ask you, what are some of the other gaps that you think we need to address urgently?
In terms of what?
In terms of making the legal parameters, in terms of getting our nations ready for this BBNJ agreement.
I mean, as difficult as it is to say, I think if you were to go to the average person and ask them what is the high seas or what are areas beyond national jurisdiction, you know, even necessarily like what do we gain from the ocean? Why is the high seas important to us? Those very basic questions, I don't think many people in the Caribbean would be able to answer potentially. And so I do think, again, we have a long way to go to even explaining how different areas of the ocean are managed, why we should be thinking about managing them effectively, and really sort of hitting home the importance of this process to not just the Caribbean, but to every single person living there.
Do you see the regional agreements? Do you see the collaborative efforts between Caribbean nations? Because there's this cliche saying that we always say we can't do this as isolated islands. But do you see the collaborative effort? You mentioned the incredible work CARICOM is doing. Do you see that collaborative effort from the region, as a region, to push forward with the BBNJ agreement?
I mean, absolutely. As I said, I think from my experience at the BBNJ negotiations, I have watched the CARICOM delegation, absolutely so many different negotiators from so many different countries coming together to really hold their own as a region at these negotiations. I do, of course, think there are places that we can do better. For instance, and of course, this is a topic that is close to my heart, but I think that, you know, in the region, we do not have a single open ocean worthy research vessel. Not one. We do not have any scientific deep water assets. These are things that we can, as a Caribbean, work towards to ensure that we have assets, science assets that are shared, and really building our capacity together to use them, and therefore be able to engage in science, because I think, yes, these are lines on a map and areas beyond national jurisdiction is different to what happens in our country's waters, but ultimately it's just a line and there's so much overlap that any benefit we get towards being able to work in international waters will also benefit us within our own country's waters. So, the benefits are twofold, if not more. I guess what I want to underscore in all of this related to the BBNJ agreement is that the time is now. We are using the high seas more and more, and we really must begin to put in place protections in these places and really think about using these places sustainably and really implement this treaty well. Because if we don't, there are parts of the high seas that we will never be able to fix if we break them. We really do want to get ahead of any activities happening there, and we know activities are coming, essentially. Time is of the essence.
For those who have followed your career, you often speak about the importance of something you call ocean stewardship. What does a blue economy in the Caribbean look like for you?
For me, well, certainly I would say I would want it to be sustainable and I would want it to be equitable. And that means managing resources effectively, preventing harm, especially irreversible harm, to the ecosystems that are there, and also making sure that the benefits are shared equally, as well as that all stakeholders are able to take part in the process of essentially using the blue economy. They should all have a say as well. So, and there are lots of other things as well, but those are the four things that come to mind immediately. Sustainable, equitable, inclusive, and I can't remember what the fourth one was I said, but they're there.
Dr. Amon, just on a final point, at the time of you and I speaking right now, you're going to run off when we're finished to listen to the US Congress speak on critical matters as it pertains to the environment. Geopolitically, do you see the willingness, the effort in the geopolitical sphere to tackle the absolute necessity, need, and critical, the critical measures we need to protect biodiversity across the world? Do you see that, or is it very fragmented?
I absolutely love that question, and I think it's such a wonderful way for us to bring in here, because I absolutely do. Immediately after this, there's going to be a discussion on critical minerals, and that pertains to areas beyond national jurisdiction also, even though it is a slightly different mechanism to the BBNJ agreement. And through these two processes, what we have seen time and time again is countries united in their dedication and commitment to moving the BBNJ agreement forward and to really believing in multilateralism and essentially the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. And I think that commitment is really wonderful. Just last week I was at BBNJ the preparatory committee meeting there in New York. And again, I was in the room with a number of states who were already preparing the first proposals for marine protected areas on the high seas. And this is just so exciting. We don't even have a fully ratified and brought into effect treaty yet there are so many countries running forward, beginning to think about implementation. There absolutely is the commitment there, and I am sure that in the next year or so, we have the United Nations Ocean Conference in 2 months. I think there are just going to be some really big moments in the next few months working towards essentially, effectively, sustainably using and conserving areas beyond national jurisdiction and the biodiversity that lives there.
Marine biologist Dr. Diva Amon, thank you very much for taking the time to being on the podcast.
Thank you so much, Ryan. It was great.
All right, and if you want to learn more about the work the High Seas Alliance does, visit highseasalliance.org. I'm Ryan Bachoo. It's been a pleasure to be your host today.